COVID-19 is a cultural and institutional virus that eats away at the foundations of organized human action. The COVID-19 campaign is best seen as a horrific coupling of two linked but distinct phenomena: the emergence of full-scale class warfare as a result of the rapid concentration of wealth over the last 10 years, and the transformation of artificial intelligence, which lurks behind automation, drones, media, and the internet, into the primary weapon in that ruthless battle by the super rich against the vast majority of humanity. A critical factor in the effectiveness of this combination of class warfare and information warfare has been the willingness of the vast majority of public intellectuals and other authority figures to go along with this current false narrative, actively misleading and distracting the general public. As a result, few people understand what is going on in the United States behind the fear-mongering, false reports in the news, with the exception of those at a high level who handle the classified planning, promulgation, and enforcement of the COVID-19 Great Reset. An increasing number of people, however, are aware that something is profoundly wrong with the United States. Abandoned by a decadent establishment, they are forced to search for truth in the trash produced by the corporate media, limited in their understanding of the world by the primitive schemata for understanding economics and politics that is produced by consulting firms, whose primary task is to frustrate understanding. A shift has taken place in American society over the last 2 years. The manipulation of digital currencies, bonds, derivatives, and other financial products, combined with the radical privatization of the banking system, has made it possible for a tiny handful of the super rich and the swarms of CEOs who buzz around them like flies to create money out of nothing and to use that money to bribe everyone in a position of authority or to threaten them. This radical class fragmentation in American society has been festering for years, but it was only with the COVID-19 crisis, when it was hyped up as a means of distracting attention from the destruction of the economy resulting from the theft by the super rich of between $5 and $10 trillion from the United States government through a series of loans to buy up stock, refinance, and transfer cash in ways that remain unknown. The operation included a series of classified directives that forced all government officials, and many in the media and in academia, to lay all blame for the economic and political disruption caused by this theft on COVID-19, and that prohibited the mention of that massive theft. This theft was the most important event of 2020, but it was never mentioned in the U.S. election. Although this massive transfer of wealth dwarfed the quantitative easing scams of the last decade and empowered a handful of multi-billionaires to run the economy without interference, their advisors warned them that such a move was extremely dangerous and that they must take ruthless measures to destroy all opposition before a truly revolutionary movement could get off the ground. This term, class warfare, was popular in Marxist discourse and formed a central pillar of mass mobilization in the 1930s by communist movements. The term is not communist by nature, however. Today, class warfare is not treated in a serious manner by the toothless left, who use the term rather as a colorful expression and not to describe this literal war. It is rather the far right that identifies the threat of class warfare and describes it graphically, although not always in an accurate manner. It is clear that the plan, well underway, is intended to reduce the entire population to slavery under the control of the 0.01%. The pathetic progressives and the flaccid left refuse to grapple with this reality, and with rare exceptions, they refuse to speak honestly about COVID-19. The best-known right-wing figure to describe class warfare was Alex Jones, whose website and news broadcast, Prison Planet, provided valuable analysis 15 years ago. Alex Jones combined a systematic release of information about massive corporate and government conspiracies with trivia and some misleading material in a manner that allowed informed viewers to learn quite a bit. I suspect that he was forced to mix in garbage with his reports because many of the materials he used were classified. Today, Alex Jones has become a popular media figure in the Republican Party, interested only in select crimes of the Democratic Party. There remain, however, plenty of other far-right sources that are willing to take on the topic of class warfare. The progressives, however, are allergic to any serious consideration of class warfare. Bernie Sanders will talk about the unfair or selfish actions of the 1%, but he refuses to mention the systematic efforts of the 0.01% to destroy the economic, educational, and cultural foundations of life for the majority of Americans. Bernie Sanders never mentions the criminal actions of Bill Gates, Elon Musk, and Warren Buffett, these progressive branded billionaires who are actively destroying the lives of citizens. There are two critical components to the current strategy of class warfare. First, the attacks are purposely audacious and extreme because it is assumed that this shock and awe approach will inhibit most intellectuals from engaging in a serious discussion or in serious organization. The big lie strategy is a core element in this campaign. This ancient political ruse, best known by Adolf Hitler's characterization of it as a fiction so colossal that no one can believe that someone would be so imprudent as to distort the truth so infamously, has played a major role in this first stage of class warfare, forcing government officials, academics, and journalists to repeat obvious lies and to bombard the public with such lies quickly reduces the intellectual capacity of citizens to reflect on current events and impedes collective action in opposition. There have been any number of lies perpetrated by the super-rich since the Kennedy assassination, but two big lies that form the core of the current ideological preparation for class warfare are the 9/11 incident and COVID-19. It is likely that the same groups were involved in planning and organizing and implementing both, and that the key planners came from around the world, not simply from the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. The best analogy for the planning of these two big lies is Agatha Christie's detective novel, Murder on the Orient Express. In that novel, the American gangster Cassetti is murdered on a train by a group of his rivals who agree in advance to sedate him, and then each one of them, in turns, stabs him once. The manner in which the implementation of the crime is shared in that novel makes the case difficult to crack, because all the major players are involved in the crime at some level. They are driven to support the false narrative and stand to face persecution and loss of face if the narrative is not maintained. The manner in which America's most famous public intellectuals stuck to the 9/11 and to the COVID-19 narratives even in the face of overwhelming scientific evidence, suggest that a similar process is in play. Those few stupid enough to demand an investigation of the facts, in those cases, have been punished. Those who have displayed leadership skills have been isolated, and the rest have been bought off with ego-flattering media coverage, which does nothing to help organize people, or with funds for research or for entrepreneurial business that comes with strings attached and thus renders them harmless. The other critical point to this preparation for full-spectrum class warfare can be found in the remarkable silence and calm before the storm. The media, academic experts, NGOs, and global organizations like the United Nations, even the so-called radical left, give the public the impression that although there are serious problems in the United States, and the country is not as free as it could be, that basically things are normal. Even as private militias roam the country, engaging in mayhem and killing, public intellectuals refuse to address the question of how Goldman Sachs and BlackRock manipulate the political process. The message that the situation will get normal, perhaps under a Biden administration, is repeated ad nauseum until citizens have no choice but to embrace this lie, or lose the ability to interact with friends and with family. Citizens are encouraged by the media to take up meditation, spend time with family, and read a book at a cafe. The implication of such advice, fed to us by corporate-sponsored self-help mavens, is that our tensions in our lives is the result of our internal emotions and internal contradictions, and not a result of external forces. It is a tendency in humans as social animals to try and define reality in terms of a social consensus, and to naturally seek out traces of the normal in daily life, and to latch onto them as a means of avoiding the painful reality of radical political and economic shifts. It is this human weakness that is being exploited by the super-rich in their project to destroy organized opposition. Thus, citizens are slowly dragged into a new reality of techno-totalitarian rule through a subtle dance, a gradual alternation between punctuated moments at which a feeling of danger and panic is cultivated, and periods when citizens are convinced that things are slowly going back to normal. This symphonic alternation between panic and relaxation without reflection means that citizens never develop their own strategies, and they are convinced that they live in a normal society with occasional disruptions, when in fact politics is becoming radically repressive with only occasional moments of release. This process is aided by efforts to frustrate understanding of who is driving this effort. The far left, groups like Socialist Equality Party that runs the WSWS report, or the Green Party, also avoid any serious analysis of who owns what and how they own it. They speak about social justice, but they are silent for the most part about the specific machinations of Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and George Soros. The far right, by contrast, is willing to go after certain billionaires, like Bill Gates and George Soros, with an appropriate seriousness. But it turns a blind eye to billionaires like Sheldon Adelson, Robert Mercer, and Charles Koch. The players who created the Trump phenomenon and have pushed for climate catastrophe and for pro-Zionist policies. Thus, the citizens of the United States are offered a baited gambit, a choice between 1. A right wing that addresses real class issues and describes massive conspiracies like the murderous vaccine regime that is being planned, but that is silent on climate change and wants to end all government, and that does not provide a systematic analysis of the manner in which Zionist and imperialist billionaires play a role in the destruction of our society, on the one hand. And, on the other hand, the choice of two, a progressive movement that promotes racial and social, ethnic diversity, talks about a more egalitarian society, makes plans for some response to climate change, but is silent on the crimes of Bill Gates and friends, even praising him for his takeover of the United Nations, and turns a blind eye to the COVID-19 scam. This unsavory choice is no accident. It is forced upon us by the super rich, who have been advised that their only hope for survival is to use their extreme wealth to fool us into fighting each other rather than confronting them. The advisors to the super rich know that the concentration of wealth and the intentional impoverishment of the population will reach a breaking point, and that citizens will start to organize. Their supercomputers have already presented them with detailed models for how revolutionary actions will unfold. The super rich want to steer those who see the criminal conspiracy and the threat of world government for the few towards the right, which lacks the philosophical and analytical framework to address class issues in a rigorous manner. That right wing is telling the truth, but the explanations for why do not include a rigorous plan for reform and for the control of global finance, but rather they fall back on simplistic narratives about threats from the Chinese Communist Party or from Jewish capital. Although there are, of course, serious financial conspiracies linked directly to China and Israel, they are part of a global integration of finance driven by IT that includes multiple players. On the other hand, the super rich want to steer those concerned with inequity and racism in society towards the ineffective multiculturalism and feel-good ethnic identity rituals of the left. The multi-ethnic new team of the Biden administration is typical of such identity politics. The ritual of appointing women, African Americans, Asians, and Indians to prominent positions in government, business and the military, intelligence and academics signifies progress, even if they are entirely products of corporate finance and of deep stakes in private equity, or in the promotion of weapons systems. The argument advanced by progressives is that there is no conspiracy, but rather that inequity we face is the product of bad apples, of greedy and thoughtless men who can be brought to their senses if only they have their photograph taken with Greta Thunberg. Goldman Sachs could not be happier than with this result. As they say on the Upper West Side, I like my fascism with a shot of progressive rhetoric and a thin layer of multicultural performance art on top. Consider how, when Drew Faust retired as president of Harvard in 2018, she immediately joined the board of directors at Goldman Sachs. There was total silence on the left concerning this blatant criminal conflict of interest. Harvard, once famous for the quality of its research, is now valued primarily for its $50 billion endowment and not for its academic achievements. The endowment and increasing the faculty who chase after corporate funding have been reduced to the mere toys of investment banks. Intellectuals who might serve as leaders are now marginalized by policies that force them to write tedious papers for obscure journals. Those in the NGO world are forced to run around begging for donations from the rich and the powerful, and are therefore incapable of articulating a message with broad appeal. None of this is an accident. The use of AI. A key weapon in the battle to the death between a tiny handful of the super rich and the rest of humanity is AI, or artificial intelligence. The threat of AI is a common theme touched upon on occasion by the attention-craving billionaire Elon Musk. But such warnings are abstract, about some future, amorphous danger beyond the horizon. and they're never presented as a threat to us right now. If anything, AI is hyped as an inevitable development in human civilization and is never presented as the political strategy of the rich to marginalize and destroy the majority of humanity. AI is presented as a boon for intellectual potential for humans that will boost creativity in a bid to distract and to mislead the reader, the audience, about the current danger. Youth are encouraged to learn computer science with the assumption they will somehow find a place to work in this alien new economy without people. Artificial intelligence is capable of analyzing massive amounts of information and coming up with aggregate conclusions. AI is used to test airplanes in flight simulations, to model chemical reactions in organic compounds, and to explore complex phenomena such as weather or ocean currents. But these are not the concerns that corporations think about when they invest billions, tens of billions of dollars in supercomputers. AI has two fundamental uses today. One, the calculation of potential profit from stocks, bonds, and other derivatives, and the formulation and implementation of strategies for maximizing that profit. In many cases, the supercomputers not only calculate the value of derivatives, they create those derivatives and thus create value out of nothing by alchemy, by magic. Two, the large-scale manipulation of the Earth's population, starting with the United States, through a complex, symphonic presentation of information and narratives that serves to, in alternation, frighten and intimidate, cajole and berate, encourage and reassure the population. These patterns of stimulation aimed at social manipulation take place locally, nationally, and globally, and they unfold on such a scale and with such complexity that unless you are involved in the plan, you will have trouble keeping up with and will join the billions of people persuaded by these AI-coordinated campaigns to engage in acts or support policies that are not in the interests of anyone but a tiny handful of billionaires. The propagandistic role of AI is perhaps one of the most poorly understood threats that mankind faces today. This also is not an accident. The next stage of brutal class warfare will be starting soon, and as the vast majority of humanity is forced into poverty and revolutionary action no longer seems unthinkable, we can be sure that AI will be taking on an aggressive new role in manipulating the thinking of citizens. It is true that there is tremendous competition between China, Japan, the United States, Germany, Russia, Israel, and other countries to develop the next generation of supercomputers as quickly as possible. The details of this competition, however, are classified or subject to non-disclosure agreements, and so most information released in the media is intentionally misleading. But the competition between nations to develop AI is increasingly secondary to the competition between corporations or even between individual billionaires to set up banks of supercomputers that enable them to engage in the calculation of profit and the manipulation of the public for their own purposes. The popular rhetoric of a new Cold War between China and the United States, for example, is used to obscure the degree of cooperation in the calculation of profit between Google and Tencent, between Microsoft and Alibaba. How much cooperation in supercomputing is taking place? I doubt anybody really knows. What we know is that the super rich in both the United States and in China have a similar interest in preempting any effort to organize opposition. We also know from the case of the First World War that it is possible to wage a brutal total war while cooperation at a higher level between the financial oligarchy continues. War does not exclude cooperation. The nature of AI warfare is unlikely to be a Pearl Harbor-like attack on the United States by a nation-state like China or Russia, but rather the systematic manipulation of all the citizens of the world that grinds them down and disempowers them economically and intellectually. Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, and Google play a central role in that these companies are controlled by global capital. Their ultimate masters are billionaires around the world. How is AI used in war? The capacity of AI is intentionally understated in the media. The basic rule for its application in business is to create algorithms for the manipulation of information culled from surveillance that it assures that almost no citizens are aware of how that information collected is used against them. It is not hard for supercomputers to outsmart and trick entire populations, especially if those populations are engrossed in playing video games, watching pornography, or wasting their time on images of food or fashion. The primary directive in this information war is that it be conducted in a friendly and sensitive manner so that almost no one grasps what is taking place until they are locked up permanently in their homes. Extremely detailed information about all aspects of the lives of most humans on the earth is already available, and programs exist that calculate the future actions or the possible response to different changes on the parts of individuals, groups, nations, and the entire world. The detail of the information available and the ability to calculate responses at multiple levels grows increasingly sophisticated. We can assume that there is a core group of, say, 5 million people globally who are carefully tracked and whose actions are anticipated because they are potential political leaders or opinion makers. At the same time, all significant groups, leftists of different flavors, Christian or libertarian conservatives, Jews, African Americans, or Hispanics, are tracked individually, in small groups, and in aggregate, and projections for their responses to political shifts are calculated. Each individual and each population group is targeted and slowly frightened and or seduced into accepting dangerous shifts in governance for businesses, schools, NGOs, and local, state, and federal government. This is done through a series of complex back and forth, an alternation of rewards and punishments, the creations of moments of crisis and uncertainty, punctuated by slow moments of relaxation. There are occasional moments of major transformation, followed by periods of temporary relaxation, during which the population is lulled into believing that nothing significant has occurred. The citizen gets the impression from this calculated process that the politics and economics of the country are a steady state, alternating between crisis and progress. The reality, however, is that society is becoming rapidly more restrictive and the government more authoritarian, serving as a tool for multinational corporations. These algorithms determine what news stories or even dramas and commercials should be placed in which media sources over what period of time so as to modify behavior and thinking patterns for each population group. Chinese Americans interested in science, conservative Christians invested in real estate, African Americans interested in sports. Because the messaging is spread out in waves over months and years, it is like the drawings of birds in the Peruvian Naza Desert that are only visible from the sky. Even the smartest mind at MIT is unable to perceive the patterns for manipulation worked out by supercomputers. Several steps had to be taken, however, before this program of information warfare could be launched. First of all, scientists employing the scientific method were removed from the public discussion concerning COVID-19, and authority figures like Anthony Fauci, a man who senselessly calls for universal use of masks, for social distancing, and for bogus vaccines, had to be held up by the media including progressive media, as a model for science in opposition to the anti-science Trump. That required them to completely overlook how Bill Gates created Fauci in the first place as a corporate hack to push his for-profit healthcare agenda. Once a stake was driven through the heart of the scientific method, it was then possible to manipulate this pandemic so as to advance the interests of the financial elites and to permit the controlled demolition of the global economy. A perfect example of the weaponization of the far left in this covert war on science is the call for mobilization given out by 314 Action, an NGO that describes itself as a grassroots movement to elect democratic scientists who will use science and facts to address some of our most pressing issues like climate change and healthcare. The Post describes the incredible work of Rebecca Jones, an expert who created a COVID database. She was fired for refusing to follow orders from the Republican governor to manipulate and falsify COVID numbers to downplay the number of cases and infections. Therefore, the posting declares we should support a COVID-19 whistleblower who is being targeted ruthlessly. But what if the entire COVID data was itself a fraud, and it is the Republican governor who is standing on the side of science? The strategists behind this post are assuming that those accustomed to progressive politics will not be able to wrap their mind around such a scenario and will thus be seduced into embracing the anti-science agenda in the name of science. The media today is filled with screaming articles peppered with scary photographs of people being carted away, wrapped up in plastic in a blatant effort at systematic fear-mongering. Many of those photographs and content most likely are simply fabricated. New statistics for how many people have become infected by COVID-19 in each city or state are plastered everywhere in a manner that displaces any real news. None of that information about outbreaks, about treatment, about vaccines, or about anything else is reliable or even believable. That is to say that all aspects of journalism have been fully weaponized. Behind the headlines, supercomputers alternate stories of dramatic outbreaks and lulls in COVID-19 cases, breakthroughs and setbacks in developing vaccines. We read about experts who suggest there's hope just around the corner, and then about others who foresee a dark winter. The process makes sure that all debate is about process and personalities, not the fundamental question of why. The corporate media focuses on the personalities of Trump or Biden, on discussions of the legal process for electing a president, or on the weather, or on just about anything other than an analysis of what is taking place. The narrative of COVID-19 is modified to meet the cultural assumptions of discrete audiences. Those who find Fox News convincing require different presentations of information from those who read the Washington Post or the Atlantic, and also different approaches are required for those who read the New York Review of Books or Common Dreams. The arguments advanced are subtly varied with the help of AI computations of the fluid state of public opinion with minute attention to each small audience. This AI-driven information warfare is best seen as the equivalent of a game of chess or Go. The supercomputers owned by Goldman Sachs or by multi-billionaires like Jeff Bezos work to calibrate precisely how to lull to sleep or how to disorient and shock individuals and specific population groups over months so that they will accept as normal an increasingly alien landscape. The privatization of the control of information in the government is also an important part of information warfare. Imagine my surprise when a friend forwarded to me a job listing for a senior intelligence analyst for North Korea at Microsoft. The trend of taking intelligence positions out of the government and giving them to private companies has increased over the last 20 years and reached a peak in the last years. Multinational corporations, accountable to no one, can't wait to drive a final nail in the coffin of government so that they can regulate all aspects of daily life for citizens in a reign of terror while using the innocuous term service to describe that process. It was announced on November 21st that the CIA will be giving massive cloud computing contracts worth tens of billions to Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, IBM, and Oracle. Perhaps it would be better to say that the CIA will be split up into fiefdoms for Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Larry Page, and Larry Ellison. And that is just the part that actually appears in the newspaper. Data by itself is not very helpful. It must be combined with a strategy for manipulation. That strategy can be traced back to the public relations and advertising strategies of corporations and government developed in the 1950s based on the principles of Sigmund Freud's disciple, Edward Bernays. Bernays developed concrete methods to manipulate the public through powerful images and simplistic slogans. He saw humans as irrational and inclined to seek out safe interpretations of events when they are presented with authority figures in accord with a herd instinct. His classic books, Propaganda, 1928, and The Engineering of Consent, 1955, form how-to manuals for political control. More recently, there was a dramatic shift in public discourse after the 9/11 incident that set off a controlled demolition of rational and scientific thinking from left to right. From comic books to science journals, all was destroyed. A horrific monster spawned by the stimulation of instinctive and reactive thinking by technology emerged to take the place of science in our society. How anybody could think that the crash of two airplanes could cause three buildings constructed out of reinforced steel to collapse into dust is beyond my understanding. Yet the American public was subject to a long line of experts who said it happened like that, and the icons of the supposed radical left, like Chris Hedges and Noam Chomsky, were trotted out to convince us that this fairy tale was beyond question. Another important part of the preparation for class warfare can be traced back to the classified programs for psychological manipulation that were undertaken by the CIA and other organizations. As far back as the 1960s, programs that employed drugs, isolation, and other forms of invasive stimulation or sensory deprivation as a means to modify behavior and thinking were undertaken with corporate backing. It was, however, the programs run at Guantanamo Bay after 9/11 to destroy the minds of prisoners using isolation, mind-altering drugs, mass, and sadistic abuse, described in the book Murder at Camp Delta by former guard Joseph Hickman, that directly inform current strategies for mass control. Such programs had nothing to do with gathering intelligence. I do not have access to the results of those experiments, but I can speculate as to what they were trying to determine. There are distinct flaws in the structure of the human brain that make it easy to manipulate people, and those experiments help to refine the specific methods. The central weakness in the human brain derives from the contest for control between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. The prefrontal cortex makes decisions based on rational analysis of the environment and a sophisticated calculation of the current situation in coordination with other parts of the brain. The amygdala, however, responds to threat with a sudden and irrational drive to flight or to fight that is not rational and that can be highly destructive. Although the amygdala traditionally played a critical role in allowing the human to drop everything and pursue self-preservation, its ability to override the decisions of the prefrontal cortex offers the manipulator a tremendous opportunity. The results of the torture programs at Guantanamo Bay, combined with the work of Bernays' modern disciples, provided the basis for sophisticated strategies to stimulate the amygdala so that its compulsive response and short-term irrationality overrides the prefrontal cortex in the individual and in the population as a whole. In addition, the pleasure centers, sexual arousal from images, appeals to food or other sensual pleasures, also helps this campaign by inhibiting long-term rational planning in the individual and reinforcing this anti-intellectual agenda through peer pressure. This softening up operation is carried out in a slow and methodical manner globally to prepare for the next step. In effect, highly educated and capable people are rendered harmless and passive through this process. The promotion of media and educational content full of advanced vocabulary but lacking logical argumentation serves to lull educated Americans to sleep. One need only read The Nation or American Prospect to see the level of linguistic sophistication employed in articles that are mind-numbing and completely inaccurate in their description of reality. The result of this process is the building of a nation of sleepwalkers, to borrow the title by the Austrian author Hermann Broch. Broch describes in that novel from 1930 how the most educated Germans allowed themselves to be led into the catastrophe of World War I with their eyes wide open. German intellectuals became sleepwalkers in the sense that they were functional in society, sophisticated in carrying out their jobs, even appreciative of music and art, but completely oblivious to the signs of collapse right in front of their eyes. The current class warfare strategy encourages precisely such behavior. The next stage in this horrific combination of information and class warfare may be launched by the COVID-19 task force appointed by President-elect Joe Biden, headed by Vivek Murthy, Indian American, former Surgeon General, David Kessler, former Commissioner at the FDA, and Marcella Nunes-Smith, African American Yale professor. The task force is positioned to play the role of judge, jury, and executioner in the pursuit of a response to COVID-19 that has no limits. Biden's statement that, quote, "I will spare no effort, none, or any commitment to end this pandemic," end quote, suggests that the door is open to massive repression of freedom of action and expression. Biden vowed to establish a pandemic testing board that will be modeled on the wartime production panel of the Second World War, and to empower the federal government to fight COVID-19 with the full authority of the Defense Production Act of the Korean War and of the War Production Board of World War II. The analogies to military mobilization to describe the tracking down of people supposedly suffering from COVID-19 and their treatment with hundreds of millions of mandatory vaccines is not random. Biden demands a national mask mandate that will force everyone to wear these masks 24/7. Such a move cannot be seen as a misunderstanding of medicine. It is a deliberate effort to force government officials, corporations, and citizens to accept orders even if they have no logical or scientific basis. The closest parallel to the mask mandate is the demand in Germany that everyone of Jewish ancestry wear a yellow star starting on September 1st, 1941. This policy, which had no basis in science, was accepted by the vast majority of intellectuals and opinion leaders of the time, and it served to create a distance between populations, to encourage hostility, and to accustom citizens to nonsensical and authoritarian policy. After a year of watching Germans suddenly forced to wear yellow stars for the first time in history, it was easy for the population to play stupid when those people were sent off to settlements in Poland and never returned. Similarly, we can imagine that the Americans will be prepared to accept the development of corona camps for groups of thousands or millions who are suddenly reported to be suffering from this disease. Citizens fearing that they themselves may be subject to treatment will have no choice but to wear smart masks, or have CCTV cameras placed in their homes, or be subject to any number of mandatory vaccines that allow corporations posing as government to inject their bodies with poorly understood substances and sensors. This frightening prospect that confronts us today, the historian Hannah Arendt got it right when she wrote, quote, "Evil comes from a failure to think. It defies thought, for as soon as thought tries to engage itself with evil and to examine the premises and principles from which it originates, it is frustrated because it finds nothing there. That is the banality of evil. AI is being used to promote a failure to think at warp speed."